Day 4. So last time in class I didn't make a video like this because I wanted you to watch 2 videos about the foster care system. One a positive experience somewhat, and then one a negative experience somewhat. And that day also, we didn't do any writing on your own personal narrative. I wanted you to consider the characters and what was happening in the story of the Glass Castle. Today we're going to be talking a lot more about character, and I want us to focus on each of these different characters. The Glass Castle does a really good job of making each character really interesting. We're going to be talking about character today because as you do your reading, I want you to pay attention to what you're learning about these characters. And sometimes the author doesn't say things straight out. Sometimes they don't say, hey, this person's mean, or this person's funny, or this person's smart, or this person's yada yada. Instead, you really get to know the characters through their actions and not just what the author is telling you about them. And with the story that I want you to write on your own, you don't have to pick the hook line that other people picked, but you might want to consider changing your hook line to make it a little more attention-grabbing, make people a little bit more interested in what you have to say. So the hook line's your start, and then after that, I want you to think about the characters and other people that are going to show up in your short story. Better stories usually have at least a few characters to show reaction and to show support. There are a lot of little parts here where you really get to know different characters. One little part that I want to share with you starts on page 44. Some of you probably aren't this far yet, and some of you are. But in this section, Brian and Jeanette, you really get to see their relationship, and even in just a small moment, you get to see a lot about the relationship between Jeanette and her dad. Living in a big city like Blythe meant I had to wear shoes. It also meant I had to go to school. School wasn't so bad. I was in the 1st grade, and my teacher, Miss Cook, always chose me to read aloud when the principal came into the classroom. Now, here's one line. This is a showing, not telling moment. The author doesn't tell us that Jeanette's smart, but the fact that we know that every time the principal comes into the room, the teacher calls on Jeanette to read out loud, the teacher is using Jeanette to show off to her boss because Jeanette reads so well. It's a really good, subtle detail that shows a lot of character. We'll keep going. The other students didn't like me very much because I was so tall and pale and skinny, and always raised my hand too fast and waved it frantically in the air whenever Miss Cook asked a question. A few days after I started school, 4 Mexican girls followed me home and jumped me in the alleyway near the LBJ apartments. They beat me up pretty bad, pulling my hair, tearing my clothes, and calling me teacher's pet and a matchstick. I came home that night with scraped knees and elbows and a busted lip. "Looks like you got in a fight," Dad said. He was sitting at the table taking apart an old alarm clock with Brian. "Just a little dust-up," I said. That was the words Dad always used after he'd been in a fight. "How many were there?" 6, I lied. "Is that split lip okay?" he asked. "This little old scratch?" I asked. "You should have seen what I did to them." "That's my girl," Dad said and went back to the clock. But Brian kept looking over at me. So here we can see a lot about Jeanette and her dad's relationship. She's bragging to her dad, she's showing off, "Oh, this little old scratch, no big deal." And at the same time, you get to see the reaction that Dad has, is pride of her. "You're my kid. Of course you beat the tar out of these kids." She exaggerates how many there were, that there were 6 girls. And you can see a lot in their relationship just in this short exchange. But Brian and her have a different relationship. He, in some ways, knows her a lot better than his dad does. And he watches her because he knows something's up. Next part. The next day when I got to the alley, the Mexican girls were waiting for me. Before they could attack, Brian jumped out from behind a clump of sagebrush, waving a yucca branch. Brian was shorter than me and just as skinny, with freckles across his nose and sandy red hair that fell into his eyes. He wore my hand-me-down pants, which I had inherited from Lori and then passed on to him, and they were always sliding off his bony behind. "Just back off now and everyone can walk away with all their limbs still attached," Brian said. It was another one of Dad's lines. The Mexican girls stared at him before bursting into laughter. Then they surrounded him. Brian did fairly well fending them off until the yucca branch broke. Then he disappeared beneath a flurry of swinging fists and kicking feet. I grabbed the biggest rock I could find and hit one of the girls on the head with it. From the jolt on my arm, I thought I'd cracked her skull. She sank to her knees. One of her friends pushed me to the ground and kicked me in the face. Then they all ran off. The girl I had hit holding her head as she staggered along. Brian and I sat up. His face was covered with sand. All I could see were his blue eyes peering out and a couple of spots of blood seeping through. I wanted to hug him, but that would have been too weird. Brian stood up and gestured for me to follow him. We climbed through a hole in the chain-link fence he had discovered that morning and ran into the iceberg lettuce farm next to the apartment building. I followed him through the rows of big green leaves, and we eventually settled down to a feast, burying our faces in the huge wet heads of lettuce and eating until our stomachs ached. "I guess we scared them off pretty good," I said to Brian. "I guess," he said. He never liked to brag, but I could tell he was proud that he had taken on 4 bigger, tougher kids, even if they were girls. "Lettuce war," Brian shouted. He tossed a half-eaten head at me like a grenade. We ran along the rows, pulling up heads and throwing them at each other. A crop duster flew overhead. We waved as it made its pass above the field. A cloud sprayed out from behind the plane, and a fine white powder came sprinkling down on our heads. I'm sure that's not very safe of them. You really get to see a lot about Brian and his personality and his relationship with Jeanette here. The fact that he knows his sister better than his dad does and knows that she's exaggerating and showing off, and then shows up to save the day when he could have just not done anything at all. He was obviously smaller and scrawny, and yet he's brave, and he took on those 4 girls like no big deal, even though he probably knew he was going to get his butt kicked. I love Brian as a character. I think throughout the entire novel there are moments of him and I'm just like, oh, you're such a cool kid. Brian and Jeanette are really close throughout this book. You'll notice that Lori is always doing other things, and Brian and Jeanette are always playing together. One of the reasons you find out later, this is slightly a spoiler, but it's not too big of a spoiler, is that Lori has actually needed glasses this entire time. And her parents have had no idea because they don't need glasses. And it's part of the reason that she doesn't go out and play with Brian and Jeanette is because she trips on things and she can't see things very well, but she has no idea that her eyesight is different than everyone else's. There's a lot that's really interesting between the relationship of Rex Walls and Rosemary Walls, the mom and the dad also. I think their characters are fascinating through the entire thing. And it makes sense that they're based on real people because they're really complex characters. They're not all good and they're definitely not all bad. Most of you have read this part already, but I think one place where you really get to see the difference between mom and dad and how they feel about their kids is when they talk about that second baby they had that died, the baby they had after Lori. It was a girl, and it happens on page 27. "Mom never seemed upset about Mary Charlene's death. God knows what he's doing," she said. "He gave me some perfect children, but he also gave me one that wasn't so perfect, so he said, 'Oops, I better take this one back.'" Dad, however, wouldn't talk about Mary Charlene. If her name came up, his face grew stony and he'd leave the room. He was the one who'd found her body in the crib, and Mom couldn't believe how much it shook him up. When he found her, he just stood there like he was in shock or something, cradling her stiff little body in his arms. And then he screamed like a wounded animal, she told us. I never heard such a horrible sound. Mom said Dad was never the same after Mary Charlene died. He started having dark moods, staying out late and coming home drunk and losing jobs. I think this really shows a huge difference between Mom and Dad, and that there are some definite negative things to both those characters, but there are also some positive things to both those characters. I'm hoping as you continue to read, I want you to read where you left off. This time we're going to do the 30 minutes again, and pay attention to each member of the family and little things that they do and say that shows a lot about who they are, what they like, what they care about, what their personality and temperament is like also. The reason I want you to focus on this is because it's really important when you're telling a story that instead of saying, Susie is nice, you actually show Susie being nice. So let's break down real quick what your homework is going to be for today. 1, you're going to be reading for 30 minutes in the Glass Castle. This time as you read, pay a lot of attention to all the different characters, especially the siblings. It's sad in the movie, there is a movie, The Glass Castle. Brie Larson, who plays Captain America, actually plays Jeanette Walls in the movie. The sad thing about the movie, though, is it really only focuses on the relationship between Jeanette and her dad, when I think all of the other siblings and even the mom are so interesting and have interesting relationships and dynamics with each other. So for today's homework, you're reading for 30 minutes, paying close attention to each one of the characters and what you're learning about them. Give me at least 3 sentences for each character. The other thing I want you to do is I want you to pick one of those 3 stories that you're going to tell, and I want you to think of all of the people who were there in that moment of the story. Yourself, obviously, is going to be one. If you're the only person in the story, then only yourself, but most likely you have other people or animals there. And I want you to give me lots of detail and character description about those people. We're going to find ways to show little details in their actions to show what their personality is like, even if it's in the way that they move or the sound of their voice or the way that they dress. So take note of the characters in your story and then the characters in the story of the Glass Castle. Okay, till next time. I miss you. I miss you guys, seriously.